I'd like to take a little bit of time to discuss the Hundred Years' War, which was a pivotal part of the foundation of the establishment of the English and French nations, and with the English nation's formation, by extension, Great Britain and the British Empire. So we have to take some time to talk about this. I'm going to be moving very quickly because this is a major partition of British history, and it had a significant influence on the formation of society. If you recall, in 1066, the Kingdom of England was conquered by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. The Normans, French-speaking descendants of Vikings who had converted to Christianity, played a dominant role in medieval Europe for 2 centuries. Even as far away as with the First Crusade and the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Normans played a major role. Well, the Normans also dominated the Kingdom of England. And so what this meant was that the fate of the Kingdom of England, which had been somewhat isolated from the rest of Europe, would now become directly intertwined with that of the Kingdom of France. So France and England becoming major long-term rivals stems from the Norman conquest of England. So going back to William the Conqueror, who was Duke of Normandy and King of England, he owed homage to the King of France for his duchy, the Duchy of Normandy. So his rule in Normandy, he was technically under the French king. It was his land, but he owed allegiance to the French king in exchange for holding it. So even though he was a king in England, he still owed homage to the King of France for that land. And of course, as the kings of England gained power, this would become a matter of contention between the kings of France and the kings of England. The situation would become even more dire when Henry II, if you recall from previous videos, Henry II of Anjou, which was a region in France, gained control of the English throne. And we use his dynasty, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and later John, as we call this the Angevin Empire, because these kings controlled a humongous portion of what's now France. They didn't just control England, much of Ireland, much of Wales. They also controlled a very large chunk of France. They had Normandy, through inheriting it through the Kingdom of England, but they also had Gascony and Aquitaine in the south, which Richard the Lionheart inherited through his mother, Eleanor, who was the wife of Henry II. Eleanor was a very powerful figure in her own right. Her family came from what's now southwestern France. They were a very powerful noble family. And by gaining control and joining Aquitaine with Gascony and Normandy and England, the Angevin Empire was a great powerhouse. And of course, the King of England owed allegiance to the King of France for all these lands, for the Duchy of Aquitaine, the Duchy of Normandy, the Duchy of Gascony. And this was a big problem because the English king, was he still the inferior of the King of France, or was he the equal of the King of France? The King of France would say he was an inferior because he owed homage for all those lands. Yet, the power of the King of England matched that of the King of France. And during some periods actually exceeded that of the King of France. So this set the stage for a significant amount of conflict between the thrones, the rulers of England and France. And this would lead to the 100 Years' War, which was a century of conflict that was on again, off again, in 3 major phases. So there would be one phase of conflict, a gradual lull, and then another phase of conflict, and then a gradual lull, and then another phase of conflict. You can see in these images the King of England paying homage to the King of France. In this case, it's Edward III. The idea being that he acknowledged the King of France as his overlord. And of course, this is something the English kings didn't want to do. This affected the prestige of the King of England. He wasn't his own man. He still had an overlord who could, in theory, call him up to battle whenever he wanted. Now, of course, this wasn't practical. The kings of England were very powerful and fought against the kings of France before the 100 Years' War, so they couldn't just be simply bullied. But this was the dynamic that was in play, which resulted in resentment by the French and the English towards one another. In 1328, the King of France, Charles the Fair, or Charles the Handsome, died. He died without children. So what this meant was that the succession was unclear. The King of England, Edward III, his mother had been Charles's sister, Isabella, or was Charles's sister, Isabella, who was a princess of France. So Edward III, the King of England, was actually the nephew of the late Charles the Fair. If you've seen the movie Braveheart, Isabella was the French princess in the movie, the one who went to visit William Wallace, who I'll mention later, as he had an impact on the 100 Years' War, even though it was after his time, due to some military innovations on his part. But if you remember that movie, Isabella, the princess, sent by Edward I, Edward Longshanks, the powerful King of England. She was the wife of Edward II and the mother of Edward III, who is the king we're talking about now. Edward III being the young grandson of Edward Longshanks. Edward III was a young king, and he was very powerful and very ambitious. Well, Isabella claimed the throne of France should go to her son, Edward, because he was the closest relative to Charles, the late king, the closest male relative. Well, the French nobility did not like that. They didn't want to be ruled by the King of England, and they didn't want the two kingdoms united. Instead, they chose a nobleman, Philip, from the house of Valois, who were related to Charles' grandfather. And so the house of Valois and the King of England, Edward III, would go to war for the throne of France. And this would kick off what we call the 100 Years' War. And this first phase of the war we call the Edwardian phase. This was a period in which England gained many initial successes. Edward III was considered a great chivalric leader, very honorable. He was the kind of leader who led from the front, and he wanted to win great fame, securing the throne of France for himself. Well, the first engagement was at sea, where the English Navy, Royal Navy, crushed the French Royal Navy at the Battle of Sluys. The statement was that the French had lost so many during that battle that the fish learned French, right? At this time, fighting at sea was similar to fighting on land. Ships were really just kind of were mobile platforms on the water. Fighting was hand-to-hand or with arrows. You didn't have a lot of equipment, a lot of artillery, or a type of fighting that revolved, that was separate in principle from land warfare. The English were very successful in stopping the French invasion of England, and so they then decided to march into France, where Edward could gain military success on land. And he did so. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, Edward III, his army completely routed the French army, smashed them completely. And 10 years later, Edward's son, Edward of Woodstock, also called the Black Prince, won an even greater victory over the French at the Battle of Poitiers, in which the Valois king at the time, the French king at the time, John II, had actually been captured. And this was a devastating blow for France, who had to sign a treaty ceding a significant amount of land to the English king. The reason that the English were so successful in this early phase of the war is due to military innovations that they benefited from. The English had spent many years under the reign of Edward Longshanks, battling in Wales and battling in Scotland. So they were fighting Celtic peoples with a Celtic way of war. Well, the Welsh generally preferred to fight at range. They were generally the best archers in Europe at the time, or considered such, some of the best archers in history, and they developed a type of longbow that could shoot a great distance and deliver such force that an arrow could penetrate chainmail. It couldn't penetrate true plate, but it could penetrate chainmail, which made most soldiers vulnerable to ranged attack. Well, the Welsh were very good at striking with these bows and retreating into the forest, right? Retreating into the mountain forests of Wales, in which they would kind of melt away in the sort of guerrilla warfare. This was very effective against the Norman armies, the Norman-led English armies who were invading Wales. This is actually where the middle finger comes from. When the Normans would capture Welsh rebels, they would chop off their middle finger and their pointer finger. So in defiance, the Welsh would come out and they would stick up their two fingers, kind of in an up yours motion. Basically, we still have our two fingers, and we're going to use them to fire a bowstring, because those two fingers were what were used to hold an arrow, to hold the bowstring with an arrow in between them, right? So if you cut them off, then that Welshman would no longer be an effective archer. And over time, that evolved to just the one middle finger. But the Welsh were very effective at keeping the English at bay for a very long period of time. Ultimately, they would lose their independence, but it took centuries for this to happen. But the English kings adapted the use of the longbow in their own armies. So they have these very large bows that are very powerful. The downside was that the longbow took a great amount of skill to use. It took many years of training. The upside, compared to a crossbow, which only took a few hours of training, was that a longbowman could deliver many arrows very accurately, very quickly, and with such force as to knock a man off a horse. Right? So these were war-winning weapons that the English learned to implement. Well, they didn't just fight in Wales. I had mentioned Scotland. During Edward Longshanks' campaign in Scotland, the English were actually defeated at the Battle of Stirling Bridge by a Scottish rebel commander named William Wallace. You've seen the movie Braveheart? This is Mel Gibson's character from that movie. One of the ways that the Scots were able to defeat the English was that they used pikemen. They used infantry with long spears in kind of tight formation in a narrow space, Stirling Bridge, to keep the English cavalry from crossing. And the reason for this, it's obvious. A horse is not going to want to charge into a wall of stakes. So this is something that the English crown would later adapt themselves, and they would take a farming implement called a billhook and use that instead of a pike, the billhook having the properties of a pike, but it was also a threshing tool for threshing grain. So it had a curved blade that you could actually drag a man off a horse with. So this meant that And the Scottish pike formations were ultimately defeated by massed archers, but the English learned to use both the Scottish methods of war, the Welsh methods of war, in concert to great effect, right? With the addition of their own mounted knights and men-at-arms, which were kind of infantry that were heavily armored with a long sword, or with a sword and shield, or a mace or other blunt weapon, axe. And so they used these this kind of combined arms approach to great effect. So the French cavalry would face down what they were called billmen, which were troops wielding the bill hooks that would keep enemy knights at bay and were effective against cavalry while they're being shot to pieces by the superior English and Welsh archers. Right? So all of these lessons that they learned fighting in the British Isles, they took with them to the continent and used them to utterly thrash the French during the first phase of the 100 Years' War. So after the Battle of Poitiers, the French crown had been utterly trounced. A period of peace emerged, in part due to the Black Death, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But France was then ravaged by groups of mercenaries called rouliers. Rouliers had been used by the English and French monarchs to fight each other. Suddenly, these mercenaries no longer had employment, and they were inside France, so they began to ravage the land. This was in part a precedent set by Edward III, who went on what was called chevauchées, which were kind of raids, devastating raids into the French countryside, in which they would slaughter peasants, kill livestock, trample crops, violate the women in villages. A very brutal way of waging war. This was hell on earth. And when this period of lulling, the lull in the fighting came, these mercenaries didn't stop. They began to extort the local population for their sustenance. But even these mercenaries had no choice but to relent in the wake of the plague. In the middle of the 14th century, one of the most devastating pandemics of all time raged throughout Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, the Black Death. About half the population of France died, and around a third of the population of England died. And of course, you can imagine that this would be absolutely devastating. The disease left the sufferer with black boils all over their skin called buboes that were highly infectious. And of course, for the vast majority of people who contracted the plague, it was fatal. Now, war can't be waged when an apocalyptic disease is destroying what was perceived to be destroying civilization. So this also helped contribute to the lull in the 100 Years' War. It's important to keep in mind at this time that people didn't have knowledge of germ theory. They didn't understand bacteria, that the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which lived inside the guts of a flea, which was brought on rats to different locations and spread from fleas jumping off of rats onto people and biting the people, spreading this bacteria, that was what was actually causing the plague. So you can imagine you're in France, and you've had this horrid war in which ordinary people have been terrorized by these rampaging armies going back and forth, slaughtering civilians. In this first phase of the war, very brutal raids launched by the English against French peasants. And then suddenly, among the survivors, half of them die from the plague. It was a horrific time. If you recall this image of the plague doctor, the kind of literary figure of the plague doctor, this is a trope that comes from the 14th century, in which doctors would wear masks in an attempt to scare away the evil spirits that were believed to cause the plague. Of course, they had no concept of modern biology. Incidentally, the Black Death would break out, bubonic plague would break out for the next 300 years in different parts of Europe in a much less intense fashion than in 1348, in which around half the population of Europe perished. But one of the doctors who had success in treating the plague was Nostradamus, the kind of figure who gets talked about on the History Channel all the time. He was actually a real person, and he did practice medicine. One of the things that he did is that he would feed victims roses. And the idea is that the roses had magical powers to protect the victim. But what scientists think now is that the infusion of vitamin C from the roses actually strengthened the immune systems of the patients and helped them fight off the plague. But that's just an interesting aside. The plague ravaged France and England both, and both societies struggled to continue fighting. The next phase of the war is called the Caroline phase. It's called the Caroline phase after King Charles the Wise, the King of France, who ends up taking the throne after John II and actually begins to regain much of the territory that had been lost to the English. The English were suffering from the ravages of the Black Plague and the aftermath. France kind of being the French king having the advantage of being the local power, was able to reabsorb much of the lands that had been lost, while the English crown was struggling with affairs in England. In particular, a peasant rebellion. Here's pictured the peasant rebellion of 1381, led by Wat Tyler and Jack Straw, two peasant leaders who rose up and attempted to kind of change the social system inside England. What had happened was that the cost of labor skyrocketed after the Black Death. So many people had died that there was so much more land that needed working compared to laborers to work it. And of course, because labor was in more demand, laborers began to demand more rights in exchange for working that land. So some of the old feudal contracts of serfdom, of, I'm bound to work on this land for you for all of my life, etc., that was no longer practical. And the average worker had much more power. And this eventually resulted in peasants rising up throughout much of Europe. Here in this image, you see the King of England, Richard II, standing by while Wat Tyler is kind of treacherously murdered. One of Richard's men sliced Wat Tyler across the throat while they were meeting to kind of talk, to negotiate an end to the rebellion. And later on, the Peasants' Rebellion was crushed. But what this meant was that the English crown had to devote their attention to matters inside England instead of continuing the fight over France. So now we're entering the final phase of the 100 Years' War, the so-called Lancastrian phase. A new king came to power in England, Henry V. If you remember the play, Henry V, by Shakespeare. Henry was a monumental military leader, one of the best military leaders in British history. The throne of France became occupied by Charles VI, who would later be called Charles the Mad. So Henry would use the occasion of his rival's insanity to justify his attempting to again assert his ancestors' claim on the throne of France. So he decided to renew the war, to go for it again, because the French have a madman on the throne. In 1415, Henry has one of the most lopsided victories in military history at the Battle of Agincourt, in which the French throw everything they have at the English army, where they outnumber the English army significantly, and are completely trounced. The French sent the best of their knights against the English, and the longbowmen and men-at-arms and billmen of the English army managed to thoroughly defeat the French. The French were charging over muddy ground, so their horsemen, which was the pride of the French nobility, the great knights, were not as effective at riding down the English archers and infantry. So Henry won a great victory, and his victory was so prominent that he instantly became the most celebrated man in Europe. In fact, he had been offered the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany by the electors there, just off of the fame of this battle, which he turned down very wisely. But he won a great victory, and he would continue to win great victories until his death in 1422. At the time of Henry V's death, the French cause looked doomed. Henry had completely dominated them in war. All the land that they had gained back under Charles the Wise, they had again lost. And the Valois monarchy in France, the House of Valois, did not possess great fighting spirit. So many French nobility had been killed at the Battle of Agincourt that the French were hesitant to engage the English in open battle again. Well, at this time, a young peasant girl named Joan began to claim that she had received a vision from Jesus to bring the Dauphin Charles, the heir to the throne of France, to bring him to power and to drive the English out of France. This teenage peasant girl quickly became very popular among the rank and file and even among some of the nobility. And keep in mind, in the 14th century, people believed that certain holy people had visions. People believed in Christianity, in God, in the Holy Ghost, and the impartation of messages and prophecy. This was not a period of skepticism in terms of religion. So this had massive popular appeal, particularly among the demoralized French who had begun to see their cause as hopeless. And then suddenly your nobility are scared to fight, and suddenly you see this young girl urging war, and the king puts her in a suit of armor, gives her a horse, and she's out on the battlefield, demanding that the great men of France, who had traditionally seen themselves as superior to Englishmen in terms of hand-to-hand fighting, demanding that they quit being cowards and come out and fight, and had a great psychological effect. And this was fortunate for the French, because by that point, they had developed a number of military technological advantages themselves. By this point, advanced crossbows called arbalètes had developed a penetrating power similar to that of the longbow. But more importantly, gunpowder weapons began to be used first in what's now the Middle East, first in China in the centuries before this, but in the preceding epoch in the Middle East with the rising Turkish Empire, and began to spread west. And the French were among the first to successfully use artillery. What this meant was that the French could use cannon to knock down the castle walls of the English. So you have these elite archers in these towers, and by having these networks of towers, the English could occupy large amounts of French land despite the fact that they were numerically inferior. Well, with the development of cannon, the French were able to destroy these fortifications, which greatly reduced the English hold on the land. And bit by bit, the French were able to regain the momentum inspired by Joan of Arc and strengthened by the use of cannon. They were able to drive the French all the way out of Gascony, Aquitaine, etc., leaving them only with the port of Calais, which they would lose. The English would lose in the 16th century. So the French became the ultimate victors in the 100 Years' War, despite being on the receiving end of most of the previous defeats of the previous 100 years. Joan of Arc would be captured by Burgundians, and we have to mention the Burgundians. You can see on this map their territory in yellow. The Burgundians were an independent power that were allied with the English against the kings of France, and they were one of the reasons that the French had such difficulty. They were being attacked from the east by the Burgundians. But the Burgundians captured Joan of Arc and turned her over to the English, where she was accused of witchcraft and ultimately burned alive at the stake for being a witch. And of course, later she was canonized by the church as a saint. It's the patron saint of France. But despite the fact that she was killed, her work was not undone, and the French crown was ultimately victorious. As a result of this 100 years of devastating warfare, along with the plague, the famine, and the devastation that resulted, during which time France was, in many parts of France, a literal hell on earth, the monarchies actually grew stronger. The governments grew stronger in attempting to prosecute this seemingly never-ending war. On top of this, by losing their lands in France, ironically, the British crown would become stronger due to the fact that for the first time, their kings had to focus primarily on England instead of using England as kind of a source of money and manpower to fight their wars in France, with the goal being the domination of France. The English kings had to now focus on Britain exclusively. And of course, they began to redouble their domination of Ireland and Scotland as a result, which will become more important, more critical during the next phase of history. But with the absence of the loss of all of these lands in France, many English noble families lost a great amount of their wealth, and this produced a great deal of discontent. This resulted in what was called the War of the Roses, a civil war between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Lancaster represented by a red rose, York by a white rose. And these two houses went to war with one another. Eventually, a Welsh noble house, the House of Tudor, would combine the two, would bring peace and establish their own suzerainty over the crown of England. And it would be the House of Tudor that produced Henry VIII, Mary Tudor, and Queen Elizabeth I. And we'll talk more about that later.